Dr. Zuroff, firstly, welcome to South Africa, and thank you for coming out for these days of the Sinai in Darba. Really appreciate it. People have loved your talks and your input, and thank you for making the effort in coming.
First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me. For me, this is not only a privilege, it's also a pleasure because of my Litvak connection and the fact that two of my grandfather's brothers, 5 brothers, came here and lived for many years in South Africa, and they're actually buried in West Park.
Wow, okay. So you have connections here, so I'm very pleased for that. And, you know, the thing that I'd really wanted to talk to you about is that people often, when they're thinking about history, there's a sense that history is just about the past. But really, I think a major part of your work, and this is with the specific connection to Lithuania, is how you tell the story of the past has major implications for the present and the future, and specifically how the story of the Holocaust is told. Because there's, maybe in its cruder form, there's the form of Holocaust denial, which says, okay, the Holocaust didn't happen. But what I think you've highlighted in your work, and I've seen a lot of the articles that you've written and that have been written about you, and that the campaigns that you are tirelessly fighting for, is another form of distortion of history, which is as dangerous as Holocaust denial, perhaps, and maybe you can say if it is or it isn't as dangerous, but it certainly is very dangerous. And it's not just about the past. This is not just about a fight for the past. It's a fight for the present and the future. And I'd really let's try and explore this notion of telling the story of the Holocaust, say, of what happened in Lithuania, what's happening in Lithuania today, about distorting that past and its implications for Jews around the world.
Okay, I think you described it very, very well. In other words, our efforts to preserve the accuracy of the historical record, especially in a country like Lithuania, are an effort to make sure that the correct lessons are learned from the crimes of the past and the tragedies of the past. And in that respect, Lithuania is a perfect example, because the Lithuanians are basically leading a systematic effort throughout post-communist Eastern Europe to rewrite the narrative of World War II and the Holocaust. And this is being done in order to hide the crimes of the local collaborators and to, in a sense, undermine the uniqueness of the Shoah, and to claim that communist crimes are just as bad as those of the Nazis, which would do a lot to deflect the focus from the incredibly important role played by local Nazi collaborators in the mass murder of Jews throughout Eastern Europe.
So just to understand and to clarify, there's not an attempt to deny the Holocaust, but it's an attempt to deflect attention away from the Lithuanian collaboration with the Nazis, which, from what I understood from your writings, and this is historical fact, that when looking across Europe, when the Nazis came into places and they started rounding up Jews to murder Jews, the warmest reception the Nazis got was from the Lithuanian Gentile population as the Nazi armies arrived.
Well, they unfortunately got warm receptions in many places.
I see.
But the extent of the participation of local Nazi collaborators in the murders in Lithuania is particularly high. Lithuania had the highest percentage of Jews who were victimized during World War II, 96.4%. In other words, there were 220,000 Jews living in Lithuania under the Nazi occupation. 212,000 were murdered, in many cases by Lithuanians. Now, the Lithuanians are doing this because, in a sense, their record is so terrible, and I'll explain why, exactly how, and in what respect in a moment, that it's almost impossible. In other words, it's proven so difficult for them to confront the truth. So they're finding all sorts of ways to change the narrative. And one of them began as early as 1991, not long after Lithuania became independent. I'll never forget, I was invited to the dedication of a monument in Ponar, the site of the mass murder of the Jews of Vilna, the Jews of Švenčian. And there was a big debate over what would be written on the plaque, on the inscription. And there are actually inscriptions in 4 languages, Lithuanian, Russian, Hebrew, and Yiddish. And only in Hebrew and Yiddish did they agree to write that the Jews had been killed by the Nazis and their local helpers. In other words, they didn't want that written in Lithuanian or in Russian. And then the Prime Minister of Lithuania at the time, Gediminas Vagnorius, was the key speaker. And he spoke about a tragedy that lasted 3 months. Everyone from Israel, the people who know the history, were looking at each other. What 3 months? What's he talking about 3 months? More than 3 years. And even worse, he said that there were a few local people who collaborated, but that collaboration is meaningless when compared to the tremendous assistance of the Lithuanian people to help Jews. Now, there were Lithuanian righteous among the Gentiles, and they deserve our gratitude and admiration, and we'll forever remember them because they operated and they carried out their noble deeds under a threat of a death penalty. And there are people like Ona Shemaita in Vilna and Elena Katerigena in Kovna and in other places who risked their lives time and again to save Jews. And this is written in letters of gold in the pages of Jewish history. But unfortunately, the number of those who participated in the murder by far outnumbers those who helped us. And contrary to efforts like that of the Prime Minister, who basically tried to present the Lithuanians who did collaborate as a few hooligans, in Lithuania, the phenomenon of collaboration encompassed all strata of Lithuanian society, from the intelligentsia, from the clergy, local doctors, pharmacists, school principal, teachers, priests, to the hooligans.
And what did the collaboration look like? When you say collaborate, what did that mean?
Okay. Let me explain something. For example, one of the issues of contention between historians, the legitimate historians, and the Lithuanians is when did the murders start? I've documented the participation of Lithuanians in persecution, physical persecution and murder of Jews before the Nazis even arrived in more than 40 places in Lithuania. Lithuanians vehemently deny it. And at conferences, for example, there was a conference about 2 years ago in the Semas, that's the Lithuanian parliament, in which they said, well, some Israeli historian, in this case Dov Levine they're referring to, not to me, but it doesn't matter, it's all the same, said that Lithuanians attacked Jews before, but that's not true. It's fully documented. That's one example. In several towns, we know that there was not a single German or Austrian present when the Lithuanians murdered the Jews. In other towns, the only Germans present were photographing. They weren't doing the killing. The Lithuanians were doing the killing. Not to mention 2 special Lithuanian murder squads. The Ypatinga Būris, it's called the Special Ones, who operated at Ponar. They're the ones who killed the bulk of the Jews murdered, 70,000 Jews murdered at Ponar. And the Ypatinga Būris were the ones who carried out the murders. Now, they had a German commander and a Lithuanian commander, but they're the ones who carried out the murders. And the 12th Battalion, sometimes referred to as the 2nd Auxiliary Police Battalion, Security Police Unit, that was sent on October 6th, I think it was, 1941, from Kovna, Kaunas, to Minsk, and on the way carried out a rampage of mass murder in Kletsk, Sluts, Rudensk, Dukara, and other places, and continued in Minsk. And were even mentioned in the Nuremberg trials, in which a letter was submitted to the court from a German district commander or district governor who wrote to his superior in Minsk about the mayhem and chaos that the Lithuanian unit had created, and begged him never to send this unit to my area again. This is the German, the Nazi. Now, you also have to understand what were the characteristics of the murders carried out. First of all, they were carried out with incredible cruelty. Public humiliations of rabbis, Jewish communal leaders, murder and rape of young Jewish girls, babies slaughtered in the most cruel manner imaginable. The nationalistic element. Let me tell you a story. I think that is very indicative and very important. On June 25th, 1941, 3 days after the invasion, a gang of Lithuanian vigilantes kidnapped or arrested 52 Jewish men, took them to a garage in the city of Kovna and Kaunas, and there, in front of a huge crowd of men, women, and children, murdered them in 2 ways. Some of the men were murdered by being beaten to death by crowbars, and the others had fire hoses shoved down their mouths and the water turned on and their stomachs exploded. Now, as this was happening, as the people were being killed, the crowd was applauding, the crowd was cheering, and then, after the murders had been completed, all the men were killed, someone took out an accordion, and they started playing the Lithuanian national anthem. And all the crowd, men, women, and children joined in. Now, I use this as an example. I very often speak to teachers who come to Yad Vashem for courses on the Holocaust, many from Europe, but from all over the world. And I ask the teachers, what on earth is the connection between the Lithuanian national anthem and the murder of these people? And the answer is that the people who carried out the murder thought they were doing the patriotic thing, as did the people who were watching. In other words, these people were doing the best thing for their country by murdering the Jews.
It's horrific, and especially when one considers the fact that Jews lived in Lithuania for almost 1,000 years. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
And people that they considered to be friends and neighbors and fellow countrymen, to turn on them in such a savage way is horrific.
You're right. As a matter of fact, before the war broke out, if you would ask people, if you would say to people, imagine a terrible tragedy in which the Jews of country X or Y will be killed, no one thought of Lithuania in that context. They would point to Poland, Romania, Hungary, countries where the level of anti-Semitism and the nature of anti-Semitism was much higher and much more severe. But in Lithuania, a number of factors sort of converged and were exacerbated by the year of Soviet occupation from June 1940 to June 1941, and the sense of many Lithuanians that the Jews had welcomed the Soviets. But of course, the Jews welcomed the Soviets because the choice they had was between having their culture repressed or having themselves murdered by the Nazis. Now, murdered by the Nazis or being repressed by the communists, which of course is not a choice at all. So were the Jews happy to see that it was the Russians who invaded Lithuania rather than the Nazis initially in June 1940?
Yeah.
Of course they were. But it was no reflection. In other words, they didn't want the Lithuanian people to suffer. That's not why they were happy. They're simply happy that their lives were spared, temporarily, as it turns out.
Yes, but I think, and so what's happening now in Lithuania is an attempt to downplay, to whitewash this history of collaboration, and the way that they're doing it, from what I understand from your writings, is this attempt to equate the fascism and the Nazism with communism, and say there were these two totalitarian systems, and the heroes of it all are the underdogs, the Lithuanians who rose up against it, and that's a distortion of Holocaust history, which is as dangerous as denial.
In a certain sense, it's much more dangerous, because Holocaust denial is so absurd.
Yes.
In view of the enormous documentation which exists to prove the Holocaust.
Yes.
And to be perfectly honest, the fight against Holocaust denial has been more or less won in the West, not in the Arab world, not in the Muslim world, where it's much more dangerous because it's government-sponsored and financed Holocaust denial. But in the West, there's no mainstream normative political party or social organization which disseminates or believes Holocaust denial. That doesn't mean we don't have to remain vigilant. But for the most part, listen, the efforts of the last 60 years to document the Shoah, to process that information in such a way to make it available to as wide a public as possible, whether it's in the form of Holocaust museums or internet sites or books, theater, movies, etc., has been enormous, very formidable. And that's what's helped win the fight against Holocaust denial. But this is something much more sophisticated. The Lithuanians talk nonstop about the Holocaust, as do the Latvians, or certainly to a somewhat lesser extent, or the Estonians, or the Hungarians, or the Ukrainians, who are all involved in this phenomenon. Okay, but what's the Holocaust in Lithuania? In Lithuania, the Holocaust is how those nasty Germans and Austrians came to our country and murdered our Jews. Nebuch. Is that true? Of course it's true. And without the Germans and Austrians, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. But having said that, that's not the whole story, far from the whole story. And in the Lithuanian context, this story is very, very, very difficult, very problematic, and this is why it's so difficult to combat it.
And also it's being now used as an engine for modern anti-Semitism. in the sense that Lithuania, there is a movement, the fascist movement even in Lithuania today, that is using this kind of resistance to communism, from what I understand, and then linking it to downplaying their collaboration in the Holocaust to a form of a new kind of anti-Semitism?
That's precisely correct. Although it's really traditional anti-Semitism.
Yes.
In other words, it's not what has happened in the West, Western Europe, where it's morphed into anti-Zionism.
Yes.
The irony of the story is that Lithuania is relatively friendly towards Israel.
Yes.
And wants to develop its ties with Israel. But one of the phenomena that we see in Eastern Europe is that the Eastern Europeans love Israel, but they don't like Jews.
Yes.
Especially their own Jews.
Yes.
But listen, in other words, the issue here is, in other words, it's not as if anti-Semitism is rampant in Lithuania today. That would not be accurate to say. But there's no question that there's a link between anti-Semitism and, in a sense, this Holocaust distortion, besides the obvious national interest, is fueled by anti-Semitism.
Yes, and the fact is we have to clarify the historical record. And part of what Lithuania needs to do is to take responsibility for the sins of the past and say that a significant portion of the population, as you said, right across the full spectrum, from leadership all the way down, were active and vicious collaborators with the Nazis, and they have to take some sort of responsibility for that. And I think maybe that's where the South African Jewish community can play a role, because we're a community around the world where the vast majority of Lithuanian Jews who survived the Holocaust by getting out before the Nazis came, as you said, 97% also perished. So those who got out before, the highest concentration of Jews of Lithuanian extraction is here in South Africa. And this is something that you and I have discussed. But to say that as South African Jews, as the descendants of the survivors, because we're all survivors, even though my great-grandfather came from Lithuania, all my great-grandparents came from Lithuania, but the one I know, Kalman Mayer Goldstein, he came at the age of 17. He lived in Vorna. He left behind his family, and everyone was murdered in the Holocaust. A few of his siblings managed to escape as well, but everyone, his parents and aunties and uncles, everyone was murdered. There's actually a letter that I found that an aunt who wrote to him just after the Holocaust to say to him, "Look, everyone's gone." It's the most chilling letter to read, where he's there and he didn't know, and he came to farm in South Africa, and he gets this letter after the Holocaust to say everyone's gone. And there's like that sense we are the descendants of these survivors, and so we owe it to our ancestors to say and to stand up and not to be co-opted. There seems to be a move, and I'm picking this up because a lot of people have reached out to me. There was the mayor of Vilna who came to South Africa a few years ago, and trying to co-opt South African Jews to support these projects. And I think that we need to be very careful and very clear is that if there are going to be projects which Lithuanian government at various levels is adopting to preserve Jewish heritage in Lithuania, we have to say to them loud and clear, if you want our cooperation with these projects, we want in exchange for that an acknowledgement of the truth of what happened, and real monuments and real documentation and real atonement. And that's got to take. We can't just have Jewish heritage sites as if the Lithuanian collaboration didn't happen. We need to, at every Jewish heritage site in Lithuania needs to be a section devoted to the sins of the Lithuanian collaborators. And I think that's a very important point.
That is extremely important. And in that respect, South African Jewry has a unique role to play. And it's very, very important that you enlist the help of the community and lead the efforts, in a sense, together with Lithuanian Jews outside in Israel and elsewhere, to combat these phenomena. And unfortunately, the countries that should be actively involved in combating these efforts to rewrite history, for a variety of political reasons that are too complicated perhaps to enter into this in the course of this interview, they're not doing it. Yeah. And that leaves it to us, in a sense, as we're doing. In other words, we're leading the efforts to do that, but there's no comparison to what a NGO can do, to what a country can do, or an organized community can do.
Yes, but I must pay tribute to you on behalf of the South African Jewish community for all of your efforts. I know that you're a fellow Litvischer Jew, so we share that heritage. As you mentioned, you have a connection to this community. But as descendants of the survivors of the Lithuanian Holocaust, we we owe, and all of Am Yisrael owes a tremendous debt of gratitude to you for the work that you've done to document, to chase Nazi criminals, but now to fight this particular fight, to not allow Lithuanian society and Lithuanian government to get away with this distortion of history.
Listen, I have to say one thing. Perhaps the most disheartening part of the effort, and believe me, I feel about it. In other words, I am so committed to this, body and soul, because I see how important it is. You have to remember, I'm a historian by profession. I'm not a lawyer, okay? But the problem is that this has been a very lonely crusade. And I want to mention my colleague, my esteemed colleague, Professor David Katz, who taught for many years at Vilna University, taught Yiddish, one of the world's leading experts on Yiddish, who was fired from his post at the university when he sought to defend Jewish anti-Nazi partisans whom the Lithuanian government wanted to put on trial on trumped-up charges of war crimes. And those efforts cost him his post, and he has not been able to find employment since. And he is devoting his time to a wonderful website called defendinghistory.com, which I hope our listeners or people seeing this interview will go to and learn from. And he especially, I would even say more than the Simon Wiesenthal Center, deserves the support of the Jewish community in Lithuania, who I think are in a position to understand the importance of what he's doing.
Yes, and the fact that he lost his position there shows this is a real fight. This is not just some kind of polite discussion that's of academic interest in the footnotes of history books. This is actually a real fight to determine the past in a way that impacts the present and the future. And the fact that the enemies of truth are prepared to go to that extent, where a person can be a professor, can be driven out of his position, shows you what's at stake here and why we must all strengthen ourselves for this battle and make sure that we don't let down the victims. It's one thing for the victims to be murdered. It's another thing. The second injustice is to deny that murder.
In other words, it's not haratzachta v'gam yarashta, it's haratzachta v'gam machakta. In other words, you've murdered them and you've wiped out their memory.
Yeah.
This is our, in a sense, should be our slogan, that we, God forbid, should never allow their memory to be obliterated for the political interest of Lithuania and for the convenience of Lithuanian society. We owe it to the victims, we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our children to make sure that the truth is known and that truth is broadcast all over.
Yes, and so from our discussion here, which will be presented to the public on the internet and through other communication platforms, we're sending out a message, and it's a very simple message also to the Lithuanian government. There's a very easy way out of this. Just own up. There's nothing else to do but just acknowledge the truth of what happened and say this was not just the Nazis on their own. Unfortunately, there were members of that society at every level of society who had who turned on their Jewish neighbors who'd lived there for almost 1,000 years in the most brutal and horrific way. And there has to be an acknowledgement of that and an atonement for that, and that has to be recorded in all of these memorials. If they're doing any memorial or any kind of Jewish heritage site in Lithuania, that is our simple demand and request.
But not only that, this is what has to be taught in the textbooks. In other words, it has to be in the history textbooks and in the government pronouncements, and they have to admit the truth. Some of the people who until now have been feted as heroes cannot be the heroes of the new Lithuania because they murdered Jews before, during the Shoah. So let me perhaps end with a ray of hope, on an optimistic note. Something very exciting and very unusual has happened over the last few months in Vilna, where one of the leading Lithuanian cultural icons, a woman by the name of Ruta Vanagaita, upon finding out that her grandfather and her great-aunt's husband were actively involved in the mass murder of Jews, has taken upon herself a mission to break the silence. And she sponsored a conference on Holocaust education, which I spoke at, and David Katz spoke, and Thomas Venclova, the famous Lithuanian dissident, all truth-tellers. And then she wrote an article in the most popular internet portal about why we have not, do not, and will never speak about the Holocaust in Lithuania, in which she juxtaposed the silence regarding history with contemporary anti-Semitic incidents that she herself experienced. And now we, Ruth Van Gaita and I, are going to write a book in which we will travel to different places throughout Lithuania to talk to witnesses and people who know the story. The book will be called Our People, and it's a double entendre. Our people are the victims. Her people are the killers. And the subcaption is supposed to be a journey with an enemy. In other words, we're ostensibly starting out as enemies.
Amazing.
And to spread the truth. And this is a woman who has the #1 bestseller in Lithuania for the last 4 months, a book about women at 60, a book who wrote a fantastic book on care for the elderly in Lithuania, which is a very important topic because there is almost no care for the elderly. In other words, she's earned the credibility, she's earned the respect of Lithuanian society. She's not Jewish, she has no Jewish origin, and she's determined, and a very courageous woman, I might add, to tell the truth. And this is the first time that someone of that caliber, of that visibility, okay, has stepped forward, because everyone else who learned that their relatives or knows the truth simply ran the other way, closed their ears, and said,
yes,
don't want to deal with it.
Okay, that's
so maybe
amazing.
This will be
that's
the
good news.
turning point.
That's very important. I'm so pleased to hear about that, and thank you for your time. And just to say, in your holy work, as you continue this work, you have the South African Jewish community 100% behind you, and we're ready at any time to come to the fore to honor the memory of our grandfathers and grandmothers.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, the privilege and pleasure of being here at Sinai and Daba and meeting my fellow Litvaks and telling them about my work.
Thank you.